The evening hummed with warmth and familiarity, the soft glow of the dining room light bouncing off the wine glasses as Lisa leaned back in her chair, laughing at a joke Greg had made. Daniel, her husband, sat beside her, his smile easy, his presence grounding. "Can you believe this guy?" Lisa said, shaking her head as she nudged Daniel's arm, still chuckling at Greg's comment about their disastrous camping trip last summer. "He gets us lost, then blames the compass." Daniel grinned, looking my way as he responded, "In my defense, the compass was busted, but hey, we all made it out alive." His gaze lingered for a moment, warm and steady, before flicking back to his plate. The faint flush on my cheeks wasn't from the wine, though I pretended it was. The kids' laughter spilled in from the backyard, a distant melody of innocence that blended with the adults' chatter. I caught Greg's eye, but he was already turning back to Lisa, commenting on her latest recipe experiment. "This dessert is amazing, Lisa," he said, his fork slicing through a perfectly baked slice of pie. "You've got to give us the recipe." Lisa waved him off with a mock groan. "Greg, if I gave you all my secrets, you'd never invite us over again," she teased, her eyes sparkling. "Besides, I like being the star baker." Daniel leaned forward, his elbow resting casually on the table as he added, "She's not wrong. I don't think I've had a bad meal in years." His voice carried an unstated admiration that made Lisa smile. It was the kind of exchange that should have been perfectly ordinary, but it wasn't. Later, as Lisa cleared the plates and I moved to help her, Daniel reached for my wine glass at the same time I did, our fingers brushing. "Sorry about that," he said quickly, his tone light, but his eyes betrayed something deeper. "Guess I'm stealing your drink now." "No worries," I replied with a laugh, trying to steady my breathing as I pulled my hand back. I'll just grab another." Lisa returned to the room, oblivious to the charged silence that had settled between us. "You two look like you're plotting something," she said with a grin, setting a tray of dessert plates on the table. "Just debating who's going to get the last glass of wine," Daniel said smoothly, the corner of his mouth lifting in an easy smile. I nodded along, my hands busy rearranging plates, but my mind couldn't shake the way his gaze had lingered, even for a second too long. That night, as I lay in bed beside Greg, the faint glow of his tablet illuminating his face, I replayed the moment over and over. It was nothing, I told myself, just a harmless brush of hands, a shared smile. But why did it leave a knot in my stomach? I turned to Greg, who was already engrossed in the documentary. "Good night," I said softly, leaning in to kiss his cheek. "Night," he replied absently, his eyes never leaving the screen. I rolled onto my side, staring at the wall. The warmth of Daniel's touch still lingered, a fleeting moment that had somehow carved a space in my thoughts. I told myself it was nothing, but my restless heart wasn't so sure. The following Wednesday, Lisa and I met at our usual cafe, our weekly ritual of catching up over overpriced lattes. She seemed quieter than usual, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly as I asked, "Everything okay? You've barely touched your muffin." Lisa sighed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "It's nothing, really, just, Daniel's been so distant lately. He's working late more often, distracted even when he's home." Her voice carried a faint edge of frustration, though she tried to mask it with a shrug. "I'm probably just overthinking things." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. "I'm sure it's just work stress," I said carefully, hoping the words sounded reassuring. "He adores you, Lisa. Anyone can see that." She smiled faintly, her fingers tapping against her cup. I know. It's just sometimes I feel like we're more like roommates than, you know, husband and wife. Her words lingered in the air long after we'd left the cafe. It wasn't just the vulnerability in her voice. It was the realization that her perfect marriage, the one I'd quietly envied, wasn't so perfect after all. And that realization made the moments I shared with Daniel feel all the more dangerous. The next time I saw him was at the park. The kids were racing around the playground, their laughter echoing through the crisp autumn air when Daniel walked up beside me. "Fancy meeting you here," he said with a smile, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his jacket. "Guess great minds think alike," I replied, shifting on the bench to make room for him. The space between us felt smaller than it was, the air carrying an unspoken tension I couldn't ignore. We talked easily, our conversation flowing from the kids' antics to mundane neighborhood gossip. At one point, as his son called out to him from the swings, Daniel leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly as he said, "It's nice having someone to talk to who actually listens." I blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in his tone. "Same here," I admitted quietly, my words feeling heavier than I intended. Our eyes met briefly, and for a moment, the world around us seemed to blur. When the kids finally tired themselves out, Daniel stood and brushed his hands against his jeans. Let's do this again sometime," he said, his voice warm but edged with something I couldn't quite place. "Yeah," I replied, my voice soft as I watched him walk away. The ache in my chest was impossible to ignore, a longing I didn't fully understand but couldn't deny. That night, as I loaded the dishwasher, Greg walked into the kitchen, grabbing a beer from the fridge. "You've been quiet today," he said, his tone casual as he leaned against the counter. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I replied quickly, forcing a smile as I closed the dishwasher door. "Just tired." He nodded, oblivious as he turned back to the living room, the sound of the game on TV filling the silence he left behind. I leaned against the counter, my chest tightening as I fought to push the thoughts of Daniel from my mind. But they stayed, stubborn and persistent, like the spark of a fire waiting for the right moment to ignite. The weeks that followed were a dance of chance encounters and lingering glances. I told myself it was all coincidence, that running into Daniel so often was nothing more than the small world effect of living in the same neighborhood. But each interaction felt increasingly deliberate, and I wasn't sure if the universe was orchestrating these moments or if, deep down, I was. It started at the grocery store one Wednesday afternoon. I had just picked up a bag of apples when Daniel's voice came from behind me. "You went with a gala? Bold choice," he teased, his grin catching me off guard. He held up a bag of Honeycrisp apples like a badge of honor. "Team Honeycrisp over here." I laughed, brushing a strand of hair from my face as I replied, "I like a little tartness." Guess I'm a risk taker." The words felt heavier than they should have, though. The casual banter continued as we walked through the aisles together. We talked about the kids' school projects, Lisa's new obsession with home renovations, and even joked about our less than stellar cooking skills. When we reached the checkout, I fumbled with a box of cereal, and his hand reached out to steady mine. "Careful there," he said, his voice softer now, the touch lingering for a heartbeat longer than necessary. My breath caught, but I forced a laugh, stepping back and avoiding his gaze. "Thanks," I mumbled, suddenly aware of how close we were. As we parted ways in the parking lot, he waved and said, "This was fun. Let's do it again sometime." His tone light, but the words clung to me long after I'd driven home. The next Saturday, I took the kids to the park, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. As they raced toward the playground, I spotted Daniel sitting on a bench, his son climbing the jungle gym. He looked up as I approached, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Fancy meeting you here," he said, sliding over to make room for me. I hesitated for a moment before sitting down, the space between us too small to ignore. "Seems like we've got the same weekend routine," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. For a while, we talked about nothing. Upcoming school events, the unpredictable fall weather, even the new coffee shop that had opened downtown. But there was a tension beneath the surface, a weight to his words when he said, "It's nice, having someone to talk to who gets it." I looked at him, startled by the vulnerability in his voice. "Yeah," I said quietly, my gaze dropping to my hands. "It is." Our kids ran past us laughing and shouting, and for a moment the world around us seemed to fade. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I wonder if Lisa even notices when I'm in the room anymore." The ache in his words cut through me, and before I could stop myself, I reached out, my hand brushing his arm. "I'm sure she does," I said, though the words felt hollow. He turned to me then, his eyes searching mine, and for a moment the air between us grew impossibly thick. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice heavy. "It doesn't feel that way." A week later, I was standing in my kitchen, wrestling with the stubborn cabinet hinge that refused to stay in place. The kids were at a friend's house. Greg was at the golf course, and the silence felt stifling. My phone buzzed on the counter, and I glanced at the screen to see a message from Daniel. "Lisa, mentioned your cabinet trouble. Need a hand?" I stared at the words, my heart pounding as I typed back. "If you're free, I wouldn't say no." 20 minutes later, he was at my door, a toolbox in hand and a warm smile on his face. "Your knight in shining armor has arrived," he said, stepping inside and shaking off the chill from the autumn air. "More like my knight with a socket wrench," I joked, leading him to the kitchen. He knelt by the cabinet, inspecting the hinge as I hovered nearby, pretending to organize the counter, but unable to keep my eyes off him. "This isn't so bad," he said, glancing up at me. "A quick fix, really. You're lucky I'm handy." "I'll take all the luck I can get," I replied, forcing a laugh. The sound felt unnatural, like I was trying too hard to fill the silence. When he finished, he stood and wiped his hands on a rag, his gaze steady as he said, "All set. Shouldn't give you any more trouble." He stepped closer, his voice softening, as he added, "I'm glad I could help." I opened my mouth to thank him, but the words caught in my throat. He was close now, too close, and the warmth of his presence was intoxicating. For a moment, I thought he might say something more, but then the sound of the front door opening shattered the moment. Greg walked in, his golf bag slung over his shoulder, and greeted Daniel with a casual nod. "Didn't know you were here," he said, setting the bag down by the door. "Just lending a hand," Daniel replied smoothly, stepping back. "I'll let you guys get back to it. See you around." He gave me a small smile before turning to leave, and I watched him go, my chest tight with a mix of relief and longing. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling as Greg snored softly beside me. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I reached for it, my breath hitching when I saw Daniel's name. "Thanks for letting me help today. It was nice catching up." I hesitated for a moment before typing back, "It was nice. Thanks again." As I hit send, a part of me knew I was stepping closer to a line I couldn't uncross. But another part of me didn't care. The boundary we'd danced around for weeks shattered with a simple text. It was early afternoon, and the house was unusually quiet. The kids were at school, Greg was at work, and I was folding laundry in the living room when my phone buzzed. Daniel's name lit up the screen, followed by a short but deliberate message. "Are you free to meet for coffee?" My fingers hovered over the keyboard, a storm of emotions whirling inside me. This was dangerous. I knew it was, but my heart betrayed me as I typed back, "Sure, where?" Minutes later, I was sliding into a booth at the cafe downtown, the scent of roasted coffee beans blending with the sharp tang of my nerves. Daniel was already there, a steaming cup in front of him. He looked up as I approached, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice warm but tinged with something deeper. "I needed the caffeine," I joked, sliding into the seat across from him. The words felt forced, a weak attempt to lighten the mood. For a while, we talked about mundane things, work, the kids, the weather, but there was an edge to the conversation, a tension neither of us acknowledged. When the lull came, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes steady on mine. "Do you ever feel like—" he began, then hesitated, his gaze dropping to his cup. "Like you're just going through the motions?" The vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard. I hesitated before replying, more often than I'd like to admit. He looked up then, his eyes searching mine. "It's hard," he said softly, "feeling like you're not really seen, you know." "I know," I whispered, my chest tightening at the rawness of his words. The cafe seemed to fade around us, the hum of conversation and clatter of dishes a distant murmur. For a moment, it felt like we were the only two people in the world. Later that week, Lisa left town for a work trip, leaving Daniel alone with the kids. She called me the day before she left, her voice cheerful as she said, "Daniel might need backup while I'm gone. You know how he is with bedtime routines." I laughed, forcing my voice to stay light. "I'm sure he'll manage, but if he needs help, I'm just a call away." The first evening Lisa was gone, my phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "Dinner's a disaster. Got any tricks for keeping spaghetti sauce off the ceiling?" I smiled despite myself, typing back quickly, "How about a little wine for the chef? I can swing by with a bottle if you're in dire need." His reply came almost instantly. "You'd be saving my life." When I arrived at his house, a bottle of red in hand, the kids were already in bed. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt heavy. Daniel opened the door with a sheepish grin, gesturing me inside. "I'll take that," he said, reaching for the wine. "You've already earned sainthood." I followed him into the kitchen, where the remnants of dinner told a chaotic story. Pots and pans stacked in the sink, a sauce-streaked cutting board on the counter. "Looks like a war zone," I teased, setting my bag down. "Parenting solo isn't as glamorous as I thought," he admitted, pouring 2 glasses of wine. "Lisa makes it look effortless." And we settled into the living room, the wine loosening the tension between us as we talked about everything and nothing. At one point, he leaned back on the couch, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. "You ever think about what life could have been like if things had gone differently?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" I asked cautiously. He sat forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he turned to face me. "I don't know. Sometimes I just wonder if I made the right choices, if this is where I'm supposed to be." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "You're a good husband, Daniel," I said softly, though the words felt like a betrayal, "and a great dad." He gave a small, humorless laugh. "That's what everyone sees. But what about what I feel?" The weight of his words hung in the air between us, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, without thinking, I reached out, my hand brushing his arm. "You're not alone," I whispered. He turned to me then, his eyes dark and searching, and before I could pull back, his hand covered mine. "I know," he said, his voice barely audible. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver down my spine, and I froze, unsure of what to do next. It happened faster than I could process. One moment, we were sitting on the couch, the space between us heavy with unspoken words. The next, his lips were on mine, soft but insistent, his hand sliding up to cup my face. For a moment, I gave in, the world melting away as the kiss deepened. But then reality crashed down around me. I pulled back, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts as I whispered, "We can't do this." He stared at me, his expression torn. "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I can't stop thinking about you." I stood quickly, my heart racing as I grabbed my bag. "I should go," I said, my voice trembling. This was a mistake. He didn't try to stop me, but as I walked out the door, I felt his eyes on me, the weight of his gaze almost unbearable. My chest ached with a mix of longing and guilt, and as I drove home, I couldn't stop the tears from falling. The following days were a blur of restlessness and guilt. I told myself that the kiss was a mistake, a fleeting moment of weakness that would never happen again. But every time my phone buzzed, my pulse quickened, and when Daniel's name lit up the screen, my resolve wavered. It was a Friday afternoon when his message came. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. My instincts screamed at me to say no, to end whatever this was before it spiraled further out of control. But my heart, reckless and yearning, typed out a reply. "Where?" "We met at a small park on the edge of town, a quiet spot tucked away from prying eyes." Daniel was already there when I arrived, leaning against the hood of his car, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. He looked up as I approached, his expression a mix of relief and apprehension. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice low. I crossed my arms, trying to steady the tremble in my hands. "What is this about, Daniel?" He ran a hand through his hair, letting out a heavy sigh. I can't stop thinking about you, about that night." His eyes searched mine, desperate for understanding. "I know it's wrong. I know we shouldn't have." "Then why are we here?" I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. "Why didn't you let it end there?" "Because I can't," he admitted, his voice breaking. "Every time I try, it doesn't work. I see you everywhere. I hear your voice in my head. It's like I'm losing my mind." His words cut through me, raw and unfiltered, and I hated how much they resonated with my own feelings. "Daniel, we're risking everything," I said, my voice trembling. "Lisa, Greg, our kids, if they find out—" "They won't," he said quickly, stepping closer. "No one has to know. We can keep this between us." I shook my head, my heart pounding as he closed the distance between us. "It's not that simple," I whispered, but the fight in my voice was fading. "Maybe it can be," he said softly, his hand brushing mine. maybe we can just have this for us. His touch sent a spark through me, and for a moment I let myself imagine it, a secret world where nothing else mattered but the way he made me feel. But then the weight of reality crashed down and I stepped back, shaking my head. I can't do this, I said, my voice cracking. I won't. He looked at me, his expression torn. Okay, he said finally, his voice barely audible. If that's what you want. I turned and walked away, my chest tight with a mix of relief and regret. But even as I left, I knew this wasn't over. That night, I threw myself into family life, trying to drown out the memories of our conversation. Greg was his usual self, absorbed in a sports game on TV while the kids chattered about their day. I smiled and nodded, playing the part of the attentive wife and mother. But inside, I was unraveling. When Lisa called later that evening to check in, her voice was light, full of anecdotes about her work trip. "How's Daniel holding up?" she asked with a laugh. "I bet he's a mess without me." "He's fine," I said quickly, forcing a smile she couldn't see. "I think he's counting the days until you're back, though." Her laughter filled the line, and I felt the weight of my betrayal pressing down on me. "Well, tell him I'll be home soon to save the day," she said cheerfully. "And thanks for keeping an eye on him." The next day Daniel texted again. I told myself I wouldn't reply, but my resolve crumbled the moment I read his words. "Can we talk? Just one last time? Please." I agreed to meet him, convincing myself it would be for closure. This time, we chose a secluded trail in the woods, the kind of place no one would stumble upon by accident. The air was crisp, the leaves crunching underfoot as we walked in strained silence. "I just need to know," he said finally, stopping in his tracks. "Do you feel the same way I do? Or am I just imagining it?" I hesitated. The words caught in my throat. Lying felt impossible, but admitting the truth felt like opening a door I couldn't close. "It doesn't matter how I feel," I said quietly. "What matters is that this has to stop." His jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "Why?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Why can't we have this, just this one thing for ourselves?" "Because it's not just us," I said, my voice rising. "It's Lisa, it's Greg, it's our families. Don't you see what we're risking?" "I see what I'm losing," he shot back, his eyes blazing. "And I don't know if I can live with that." His words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. I stared at him, my chest tight with a mix of anger and longing. "You have to," I said finally, my voice trembling. "We both do." As I drove home, my heart felt like it was being pulled in two directions. Part of me wanted to turn back, to give in to the pull of everything Daniel represented, but another part of me, the part that still clung to the life I'd built, knew that this was the only way. When I walked through the door, Greg was waiting for me, his brow furrowed in concern. "Oh, you've been gone a while," he said, his tone light but questioning. "I just needed some air," I replied, forcing a smile. "Everything's fine." But as I sat beside him on the couch, the weight of my secrets threatened to suffocate me, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if I could keep pretending. The tension in my life had become unbearable. Every interaction with Daniel felt like a razor-thin edge slicing through my resolve, and every shared laugh with Lisa, every quiet moment with Greg, felt like a betrayal magnified under a glaring light. The weight of the affair, or whatever this was, had transformed into an invisible storm cloud, following me wherever I went. It all came to a head at the annual neighborhood barbecue. The backyard was alive with chatter, the scent of grilled burgers and hot dogs wafting through the air as kids raced around with popsicles in hand. Lisa, as always, was the star of the event, effortlessly moving between conversations and checking on the food. Daniel was quieter than usual, sticking close to her side, but his eyes found mine across the crowd. It was a brief glance, one I tried to ignore, but the familiarity of it sent a rush of heat through me. Lisa appeared beside me, balancing a plate of food in one hand and a glass of wine in the other. "Isn't it nice to see everyone together?" she said, her smile bright. "I feel like we all get so caught up in our lives we forget to take a moment to just be." I nodded, forcing a smile. "It's great," I said, but my voice sounded hollow, even to my own ears. I glanced toward Daniel, who was talking with Greg now, his laughter carrying over the noise. The sound sent a pang of something I couldn't name through me. Lisa's voice softened. "You okay? You seem distracted." I turned back to her, my heart pounding. "I'm fine, just a little tired," I said quickly, hoping she couldn't see through the lie. But Lisa wasn't one to let things go. She leaned in closer, her tone playful but probing, as she said, "You and Daniel have been spending a lot of time together lately. Should I be worried?" Her words were meant as a joke, I could tell by the lightness in her voice, but they hit me like a punch to the gut. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. "Don't be ridiculous. He's just been helping out with a few things around the house." Lisa's smile didn't waver, but something in her expression shifted, a flicker of doubt crossing her face before she masked it with another sip of wine. The next day, Lisa stopped by unannounced. I was in the middle of cleaning the kitchen when she appeared at the door, her usual warmth replaced by a guarded demeanor. "Hey," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I thought I'd drop by. It's been a while since we had a real chat." I nodded, wiping my hands on a dish towel as I motioned for her to sit. "Sure. What's up?" She didn't sit. Instead, she crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing slightly as she said, "Is there something you want to tell me?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun, and my heart sank. "What do you mean?" I asked, feigning confusion. Lisa's voice hardened, her usual warmth replaced by an edge I'd never heard before. "I mean, I've been hearing things, people talking about how close you and Daniel have been. And then I found this." She pulled her phone from her pocket, her fingers shaking slightly as she handed it to me. On the screen was a message from me to Daniel, one I'd sent weeks ago. It was innocuous enough. "Just let me know if you need anything else." But the context, the familiarity, was impossible to ignore. "Lisa, uh, my voice faltered, the words caught in my throat. My mind raced for an explanation, but none of them sounded convincing, even to me. "Is there something going on between you two?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Because if there is, I swear to God—" "No," I interrupted, my voice cracking. "There's nothing. I would never do that to you." But even as I said the words, I could see the doubt in her eyes. The damage was done, the cracks in our friendship widening into an unbridgeable chasm. When Daniel called me later that evening, his voice was frantic. "Lisa confronted me," he said, his words tumbling over each other. "She found the texts. She's losing it." I closed my eyes, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. "What did you tell her?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "That nothing happened," he said quickly, "but I don't think she believes me." My chest tightened, and for a moment I couldn't speak. "Daniel, I think we've done enough damage," I said finally, my voice trembling. "We need to stop this, for good." There was a long pause before he replied, his voice heavy with regret. "You're right. I'm sorry." "Me too," I said, tears spilling down my cheeks as I ended the call. Lisa stopped speaking to me after that. She didn't confront me again, didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any accusation she could have made. At neighborhood gatherings, she avoided me, her once bright smile now reserved for everyone but me. Daniel was quieter too, his usual easy charm replaced by a tension that hung over him like a cloud. Greg, oblivious as ever, didn't notice the shift, or maybe he did and chose not to question it. Either way, the cracks in our marriage grew deeper, and I found myself retreating further into my own thoughts. The fallout was slow and painful, a quiet unraveling of the life I'd built. Lisa and Daniel's marriage survived, though the distance between them was palpable. My own marriage, already fragile, teetered on the edge of collapse, though Greg and I both pretended otherwise. And as I sat alone in my kitchen one evening, the house silent around me, I realized the cost of my choices. I had lost Lisa, the one person who had always been there for me, and I had jeopardized everything for a fleeting connection that could never have lasted. The weight of that realization settled over me like a stone, and for the first time in weeks I allowed myself to grieve, not just for what I had lost, but for what I had destroyed. The silence in my life was deafening. Lisa's absence felt like a gaping wound, a constant reminder of the friendship I'd shattered. She didn't return my calls or texts, and every attempt to reach her was met with a polite but firm wall of avoidance. It was clear I had been cut off. I couldn't blame her. I wasn't sure I would have forgiven me either. Greg, on the other hand, carried on as though nothing had changed. If he noticed the tension between Lisa and me, he didn't say anything. But there were moments, quiet pauses when his eyes lingered on me longer than usual, when I thought he might have suspected something. If he did, he never confronted me. Instead, he filled the silence with work, sports, and the mundane routine of our lives. It was easier that way. The final blow came weeks later at a neighborhood meeting Lisa hosted. It was the first time I had seen her since everything unraveled. She was poised, her smile bright as she welcomed everyone. But when our eyes met, hers hardened, her smile vanishing like a shutter closing. She spoke to everyone except me, her words carefully directed around me as though I didn't exist. At one point, Daniel approached me, his expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low. I hesitated, glancing around the room. Lisa was across the kitchen, laughing with a group of neighbors, her back to us. "What's left to say, Daniel?" I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's over." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything." I looked at him then, seeing the weight of his guilt reflected in his eyes. "Me too," I said softly, the words carrying more weight than I realized. "But it doesn't change anything." As the weeks turned into months, the distance between Lisa and me became permanent. She moved on, rebuilding her life with Daniel, their marriage seemingly repaired, though I could only guess at the cracks that still lingered beneath the surface. Greg and I continued our routine, but something fundamental between us had shifted. The foundation of our marriage, already fragile, felt irreparably fractured. One night, as I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at an untouched cup of tea, Greg walked in. He leaned against the counter, watching me for a long moment before finally speaking. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his tone careful. "I've just been tired," I replied automatically, my gaze fixed on the swirling steam of my tea. Greg sighed, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. Is that all it is? Because it feels like you're miles away." The question hung in the air, heavy and accusing, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. Instead, I stood, the chair scraping loudly against the floor as I carried my tea to the sink. "I'm fine," I said, my voice hollow. "We're fine." But as I walked out of the kitchen, leaving Greg alone in the dim light, I knew the truth. We weren't fine. We hadn't been fine for a long time. Months later, I passed Lisa on the street. She was walking with her kids, her laughter carrying on the breeze as they darted around her. She didn't see me at first, but when she did, her smile faltered. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of everything unspoken hanging between us. Then she turned away, her hand on her son's shoulder as she guided him across the street, leaving me standing there, frozen. I watched her go, a lump rising in my throat. The ache of loss, of everything I'd destroyed, settled over me like a weight I'd carry for the rest of my life. In the quiet of my home that night, I sat in the living room, the faint hum of the TV playing in the background as Greg dozed off beside me. The weight of my choices pressed down on me, the magnitude of what I'd done finally sinking in. I had gambled with everything that mattered. My marriage, my friendships, my sense of self, and lost. There was no redemption, no neat resolution to tie the story together. Life moved on, as it always did, but the scars of my actions would remain, a constant reminder of what I'd thrown away. And as I stared into the flickering light of the television, I realized that some mistakes can't be undone. They can only be lived with.